Well, hello, everybody. This recording, this lecture is going to be the first part, actually, of a series of lectures that I'm going to be doing with you on westward expansion. We'll call this one Lecture A, I guess. There might be a B. Well, there's going to be a B and possibly a C as well. So, what I want to do is kick this off with some slides here for you, if I can get them to come up. Here we go. Um, And so, again, westward expansion will be starting from realistically the northwest ordinances that we've talked about. And this is going to start realistically with assignment 28, going through 29, and a little bit further than 30 and 31 here. So, if you look at this map to kind of start us off with here, as we go into post Revolutionary War, you can see how the North American continent is sort of divided up into different parts. And when we talked about this earlier, we said that there were really there are really five actually major superpowers that are at play. Actually, four major superpowers and us. We'll call us the fifth here. But if you look at this map, you can see that the British are pretty much controlling what is after post-Revolutionary War, what is now Canada, and then they have some disputed territory over here where present-day Washington is, and Montana and Idaho and the western part of Canada. And going actually all the way down in here into Oregon and out towards Wyoming and whatnot. This is disputed between the British and the Russians. Okay, and then you can see this big swath of territory here being claimed by the Spanish. And then if I was to take my pen here, sort of draw you a line, here we have down here we have New Orleans, or the port of New Orleans, which gives us access to that amazing, long, and very, very powerful river that we call the Mississippi that runs up this way. And then off of the Mississippi, we have another river that we've talked about, or that we will talk about in this unit, called the Missouri River. And that's going to be running sort of like this, all the way up here across into this area. Okay. So again, as you can see, the major influences here, right, are the Spanish, and the Spanish have all this land, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they control it physically. Okay, and that's something to keep in mind. Again, the Spanish are all the way in Europe, along with these other powers like the British, the Russians, and the French, but it doesn't mean that they have a lot of people living here. It's sort of like more like they stuck a flag in the ground and basically said, we're going to claim this land for ours. And it's very similar to what we see the British do over here on the East Coast, right? What they've done early on in North American sort of Western occupation. So this kind of give you the scope here, right? And as we start to move west, as we start to move in this westerly direction here across, into North America. Sorry for the really bad arrow there. This area here was called the Indiana or Indian Territory around the Great Lakes. And then we've got that swath of mountains that we call the Appalachians that run along this point here, sort of north to south. That's sort of that earlier barrier that we've talked about that prevented people from crossing over. So the Proclamation of 1763 that we've talked about was sort of that no go zone, right, past that point. Well, that's all over now, because, well, the United States is in charge. It has its own flag, its own country, its own government, and so we're starting to see that that's not a barrier anymore. Okay, so let's kind of take a look at where we've been so far and where we're going to be going here in this really from here on out through the rest of the year. I think is a good point to do this. Timelines are only good for one thing: to give you a sense of, direction, or give you a sense of where we've been and where we're going to be going. So let's kind of highlight this, and we won't spend too much time on this, but let's take a look at these events, right? American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. 1786, what do we have? We have Shays Rebellion. 1787, we have the Northwest Ordinance, which establishes that way that we're going to be dividing land up. 1789, we have the creation of the U.S. Constitution, which we've talked about. 1794, under Washington's presidency, the Whiskey Rebellion, right? We've talked about how he responds to that, how he uses the Constitution as a tool now to raise an army, to put down this rebellion, to really establish the United States as a country that has powers, that has the ability to respond to crises. Then we have the Louisiana Purchase, right? Over 500 million acres of land bought for 15 million bucks. I think maybe somewhere, some of you may have heard me say 3 million. That was wrong. It's a $15 million purchase, which doubles the size of the United States. You can see we add all this land to our area of influence now, our sphere of influence. We like to use that term. And then we have that amazing expedition now you guys looked at last week, the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? A essentially 28-month-long journey that is going to link, east to west, from sea to shining sea, right, as they might say. And it becomes a really significant expedition for the information that's provided to the United States government about who's out there, what native populations, what languages are we looking at, what is the physical features of this continent looking like now. We notice that we have a giant range of mountains that are identified here that run along this part of the continent where my pen is at here. We call those the Rocky Mountains, right? So this western mass of craggy granite, tall, snow-capped mountains that are going to separate now further a western coast from the Great Plains, and then the east coast over here where the Appalachian Mountains are. So lots of stuff happening there. We're going to move forward in this unit and talk about the War of 1812, conflict that starts between the British and the Americans. And it's over a series of issues, primarily having to do with control of the open seas and the British essentially hijacking our ships at sea, which was against the law, and we didn't like that. Then we're going to talk about something in 1823 called the Monroe Doctrine, which establishes really our foreign policy, if you want to call it, in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, we typically break up the world into two parts. We call one side the Western Hemisphere and the other side the Eastern Hemisphere, and we divide that, if you see where my pen's going up and down here, right down through the Atlantic Ocean. So we're going to say, hey guys, this is our part of the world. You guys stay on your side and we'll all get along just happy. Well, it doesn't always work out that way, but that was the intent, okay? 1825 comes along. We're going to have the creation of a really, really important, well, at least it was at the time, a really important transportation corridor called the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, which by the time it was actually finished becomes obsolete because railroads will be introduced into the United States. 1835, we have the Texas War of Independence. You know, when Texans say everything's bigger or better in Texas, well, there's an attitude that comes with that we'll talk about. And that comes from their independence, which they actually had. Texas was really an independent republic for more than 7 years. And that's why I think a lot of Texans that live in Texas or are from Texas have this sense of pride that they don't really need the rest of the United States because they can do it on their own. And we'll take a look at that later and talk about why that attitude exists. 1846, we're going to have something known as the Mexican-American War. How does the United States grow so big? How does it gain all this Western land? Well, we're going to pick a fight, basically, with Mexico. Yes, we pick the fight. We force them into a fight, and we're going to win as the United States. And that's going to force the Mexicans to secede, is the term that we use. All the Western lands, basically from New Mexico and Colorado to the west, okay? And that's going to occur under a treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. 1848, a really important date for women in this country. We have a essentially a meeting that takes place in New York. Okay, uh, that's called what is it called? I'm having a brain failure here. Um, it's the women's rights first. It's basically our first women's rights meeting to establish what women want to try to achieve in this country. Um, and I don't know why I'm having a mind failure right now, but I'll tell you later what the actual name of the conference was. But it happens in upstate New York. 1849, the American Gold Rush, or the California Gold Rush. Gold is discovered around the Sacramento River, up around Sacramento, and it's going to change everything on the western coast. It's going to really establish California and create a state like overnight. Then we're going to go all the way to 1861 and the start of the American Revolution, a war that lasts 4.5 years and literally has more deaths in that war than all the other wars combined in American history. Okay, lots of young men will lose their life in this civil conflict. And then we'll get into basically Reconstruction, what happens after that, and then this class is basically over. Okay, that's where we'll stop at from there. All right, so a lot of stuff going on there. And to start this off, let's go take a step backward. If you're watching this video with me now, let's talk a little about a topic that you've already studied a little bit, and that was how the United States decides how it's going to organize itself. How do states become states? How do townships become townships? How do we divide land up and use that land to make money? Okay, to make money and to basically pay off America's debt. And that has to do with the expansion of our country and the expansion of states. So if we do that, we have to start with the land ordinances, of course, of 1785 and 1787. And this map here is intended to show you, and this line here that's in red represents the Appalachian Mountains. And the area that we're going to be talking about here is where I'm circling around the Great Lakes, right? And the whole point of these land ordinances was to create opportunity for growth, right? So we put laws into place. Here's my laws to give people the opportunity to have rules and regulations about how land will be sold, how it will be divided up into parts, and how we'll create opportunities for representation in Congress. Okay. Remember, the rules of 1785 basically outline how towns will be formed and how land will be divided. And 1787 gives us background or knowledge or rules about how states will be formed. So how does it work, right? Again, we've talked about this a little bit. You have to survey the land. You have to come up with some basic rules of how land will be divided, how it will be mapped out. Then you have to map that area here. And here's a map of some gentlemen from, this looks like World War I or World War II doing topographic maps. And then it has to be organized, right? So all these principles have to go into play to make this happen. Interestingly enough, some of our earliest surveyors, American surveyors in the United States, actually one of them was George Washington when he was really young. Before he actually entered the military with the British, he was actually a surveyor. He actually would go out with another person or a small team of people out into the wilderness and draw maps, shoot points across mountain to mountain, draw in features of rivers and hills and forests and things like that. He was one of our first surveyors officially in the United States. He wasn't the only, there were hundreds of them, but he was one that sort of mentioned as honorable mention here. Okay. So in our notes, by the way, just to kind of remind you that along with this lecture, There are notes that go with this as usual, and I guess I should have reminded you of that before we started here. If you go into the Google Classroom again, you can find a copy of those notes under the classwork tab. And as always, my recommendation for you is to follow along. Follow along with the notes, right? Our lecture notes, GS7. Sorry for the delay here. Use those notes to help you to guide you along through this process. And there's a lot of notes in this unit. In fact, there's several pages of them. And we're going to break this up into different parts to kind of break it down for you in smaller chunks. But here's the notes for you there. Okay, let's get back to this. So land ordinances made a structure for how new states would be formed. And then, of course, these policies opened up a new way for settlement of the territories in more of a clear and orderly manner. The land ordinances of 1785 established a procedure for surveying and selling Western land, right? And one of the motivations behind this was that the United States government was trying to figure out a way to pay off its debt. Remember, it had a pretty large debt to the French for fighting the American Revolution. And of course, to be a good nation, you want to pay your creditors off. And the United States was no different in that way. In order to borrow more money, you have to be able to pay off debts that you have, right? So it's like establishing what we would call good credit in this case. So we have America wants to pay off its debt, and there were lots of people who were willing to pay small amounts of money to go out into the wilderness and buy a chunk of land to start a farm or to establish their residence in an area, because that's what prosperity basically starts with. 1787, the Northwest Ordinance focuses on this area around the Great Lakes. And again, the whole point of the Northwest Ordinance is to give us rules about how we would start to define political boundaries. And in this picture here, in this map, you can see how that was done. If you go back to assignment 28, I believe it was, this kind of re-illustrates that point where we sort of divide up land into parts, right? In this particular case, it's showing you Virginia, and it's showing how a map essentially was divided into ranges, and then in that range there were 6 by 6 mile squares that were developed, and then that could be like a township that was 36 square miles, and then we could break those townships up into 36 parts, 1 mile square each, and then again you could break those up into quarters, half sections, and then you could sell off the land, right? A quarter section of a 1 mile square block is 40 acres, right? 40 acre sections. So you might have many families buying an acre within this quarter, or you might have somebody who was really, really wealthy who wanted to start a big farm or something. Maybe they might have bought a 40 acre plot. All this would be laid out on a map. Deeds or deeds of ownership would be given to those people so that they could prove that they own the land. And that's really how the United States begins to be settled in an organized way. Remember last week, we also mentioned that there was a victim of all this, right? The native population is not really talked about here, but Native Americans, that is, were occupying this land, but never really saw an understanding or believed in the value of ownership of land. And as you study assignment 30, actually 31 this week, when you look at Chief Tecumseh, one of his chief arguments is, how can you own land? Land is it's shared by everyone. It's used by everyone. The water, the wildlife, the timber, and there's a real sort of collision of cultures here and this idea of ownership between native populations and what we would call Western or European influence cultures, like this new American culture, this new uh, Caucasian or white group of people that are coming in here, you might say. Okay. So we see a real clash here of this, and that's going to be a big problem. All right. So states' rights, the formation of states is a big topic there, and sort of how that land's divided. Let's move on to another topic, which is expanding government power. And this is a bit of a review as well. Remember what happened in 1786, right? Daniel Shays, he's an angry farmer. He feels like he's being taxed too much by the government. So what does he do? He lashes out. He revolts. He gets a whole bunch of other farmers together because they feel like the land that they're being taxed on, or the taxes on their land, are unjust. They go to the Massachusetts governing body. Massachusetts does not listen to them, and so they revolt, right? What does the government do? Well, the national government doesn't really do anything because the Constitution doesn't give them the power to do anything, because the Constitution doesn't exist yet. Remember, all we have is the Articles of Confederation, and Congress doesn't even have the ability to raise an army to stop them. So Massachusetts has to step in, the militia steps in, they put the rebellion down, but it sends a very, very loud signal to the new government that the Constitution needs to be strengthened. It needs to be reinforced. Few years later, 1794, here we go. Now George Washington is in office. Now we actually have a constitution signed and ratified, actually 1789, right? Or excuse me, 1789. A few years later, we have another rebellion. There's a tax being placed on whiskey, right? This whiskey rebellion, as it's called. This time, the Constitution has power, and it has the power to raise an army. In this case, 15,000 men are raised by Congress, led by George Washington, to put this rebellion down. So, what do we start to see in this sort of time period, this late 1700s? We see the emergence of a stronger constitution. We see the emergence of a Congress that has the ability to act, and people have to follow the law, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest things here. There are laws that have to be followed, and you can't just go and rebel and do whatever you want. There are consequences for that. So that becomes a really, really important issue. And now, again, like I've said, we have three branches of government here in this illustration. It's much stronger. And there's no loss of life in the Whiskey Rebellion. Nobody goes to jail. Everybody basically gets an opportunity to go home, and they take that opportunity. But now the Constitution is here to stay. Here again is another illustration, sort of showing you the differences of it, right? What do these two rebellions have in common is a question I always like to ask you. And it has to do with taxation, right? Farmers were asked to pay taxes to help pay off debt. And, taxation has always been a hot topic for Americans, whether it goes back to the American Revolution, when we feel like we were being unjustly taxed, or we talk about Shays' Rebellion, or we talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. Taxes have always been a major issue. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but we also understand that we have to have taxes in order for the government to function and for the United States to be secure and safe, for us to have roads and bridges and all these other things, right? So the commonality here, though, is it's also about paying off a debt, a war debt. So if we go back and we think about why those land ordinances of 1785 were established and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, really it was about paying off debt there too, right? It's the same sort of issue. Sell land, pay off debt. Another big topic that we've touched on is this expansion west, what we call something known as the Age of Jefferson. The Age of Jefferson. In assignment 29, you guys studied a little bit about the election of 1800, and this whole real like almost like a drama, right? Like a soap opera between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. How one man's sort of like ego, that is Adams in this case, sort of really in his real federalist sort of principled strong central government attitude sort of conflicts with Jefferson's, who was much more about the idea of a democratic republican form of government, power to the people, power to the states, versus Adams and his central government sort of philosophy. So election of 1800 happens. In March of 1801, Adams is going to lose. He's not going to be a president for more than one term. Jefferson will come in, he will take power. And one of the significance also of this, again, is this is a peaceful transfer of power between two different political parties. Adams as the Federalist, Jefferson as the Democrat or Republican. There is no conflict. There's no rioting. There's no burning down buildings. There's no storming, New York, which was the capital at that time. Actually, no, it was actually Washington, D.C. had been established. I take that back. So there was no, rushing to like take over any institutions. One man gets in his carriage and goes back to his home in Braintree, Massachusetts, and another man, that is Jefferson, assumes the power of the presidency. It's a really important aspect of democracy here. So what does Jefferson do as president? One of the things that he's probably given the most notoriety for was certainly the Louisiana Purchase, right? He buys this big chunk of land from France. He doesn't pay $1 million for it. He doesn't pay 30. He pays, well, Congress pays 15 million bucks, right, for this big chunk of land in 1803. And so this really opens up what we would call the Midwestern or the agricultural center of North America in this area here. It tends to be rolling hills, flat grasslands. Most of the Native Americans that lived in this area that you see in brown here were pastoral Native Americans, we like to call them. They like to move around, right? They like to follow the herds of American bison that were moving in the millions across the prairies of the Midwest. And so they would, camp in an area, they would hunt, and then they would stay there for a few months, and then they'd pack up everything and they'd move and follow the herds that were here. So as we come into this discussion, and Lewis and Clark set off along the Missouri River to find that link to the Pacific Ocean under Jefferson's tutelage, you could say, right? Because Meriwether Lewis was actually one of Jefferson's close aides during his presidency. We start to see the exploration of this continent, and we start to get an idea of what's out there. Again, the key here is we buy this from France, from Napoleon, for $15 million, and we double the size of the United States. So here we have it. Here's our little Napoleon. This land is useless. Please take it off my hands. I'm only asking 15 million. And of course, Jefferson says, yes, absolutely. We don't have to have any conflict with anybody. We can just basically give them money, and then we can put our flag in there and remove the French flag. All this time, knowing that the Spanish are still occupying most of the western part of North America, and there's a whole bunch of Native Americans out here that are living off the land, essentially. Jefferson's legacy, if you think about it, is really one as an academic. He's a shrewd politician. His appointment of Lewis and Clark to go on this expedition becomes really significant in American history. I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you guys in class or not, but you can actually go see the diaries of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The diaries there's many of the diaries are actually in Philadelphia in the same building, or in a building that's on the same property as Independence Hall. Uh, there's like a little library there it's called the Lewis and Clark Library, I think. And they have a lot of memorabilia from this expedition that you can physically see. We know a lot about this expedition because both of these gentlemen kept very detailed diaries of their daily activities during the whole trip, like day by day. They told, what did they eat? What were some of the conflicts that they ran into? What were some of the hazards? What were some of the, the moments of contact with Native Americans? And they wrote it down in their own words. It's really a beautiful diary of essentially them opening up a window to the rest of the world from their point of view. And I highly recommend you go check it out if you're ever in that area to go see the Liberty Bell, or you're ever in Philadelphia on a trip sometime. Go check it out. Here again is another map. Here kind of shows you the direction that they were taking, right? Starting off here in St. Louis, following the Missouri River. Took them more than, it took them almost 2 years just to go there, but only 6 months to come back, right? Obviously, not knowing where you're going slows you down. And having to go during the middle of a winter where they had to stay over during a winter because it was just too much snow to pass through was a significant issue for them too as well. So a little slower going, much faster coming back, in part because they were going downriver on the Missouri once they got to the Missouri River here. So again, water flows downhill, right? In this case, the Columbia River starts in the Rocky Mountains and it flows to the Pacific. So when they got to the Columbia, they were going downstream. When they were going from St. Louis to find the source of the Missouri, they're going upstream, so it was much slower. So this leg of the journey was much faster on their return home because they were going downstream with the current, right? Which gives them a little bit of a speed advantage there. Notice how in these lines, there's a lot of different lines going here. They went together when they were going west. They stayed together as a group. When they came home, they actually split up into two parts. One was to further explore different passages over the Rocky Mountains. So they met back up in North Dakota here on their return home, but they actually did split up on their return back to St. Louis. So an amazing trip, lots to talk about there. All right. So here we go, a little bit of a moving west map here to give you a sense of space. Here we have our Rocky Mountains. Here we have our Appalachian Mountains. Here's New Orleans. Here's the mouth of the Mississippi, right? Mississippi is flowing from north to south. And then the Missouri is flowing from east to west. In fact, in this case, it's flowing towards the east, southeast here into St. Louis, okay? If I add a little bit more, here's that Louisiana territory that the United States buys from France in 1803. And then the following year, Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark out on that expedition to try to find the origins of this river, the river that runs right through the middle of the territory. And there we go, 1804 to 1806. And that'll link up sort of the west to the east here. This is an important map that is actually drawn because this map, actually, the Lewis and Clark map, will become the foundation of other maps that will be drawn by people when we talk about moving west later on in about 50 years from this time. When we start to see more and more people migrating to the west, we're gonna run into something that's known as the Oregon Trail. This wagon trail that would run from the Mississippi River towards the Oregon country here. So this map that's created by these gentlemen, that's further refined by other people that follow them, becomes really, really significant to give people a way to navigate over this vast territory. All right. So, really significant as a way to open up the West. Again, here's our Indiana or Indian Territory here around the Great Lakes. Here's where the Northwest Ordinance was established earlier on. All right. I'm going to talk about one more topic in this segment, and that's expanding abroad. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on here with the British and the Americans. All right. So what's happening after the Lewis and Clark expedition? Well, or what's happening during that expedition? We have had for quite a long time, the French and the British who have been at war with each other in Europe. And that war has spilled out and over into several areas. One of them is the Atlantic Ocean here. Okay. So the British and the French have been at war. They're both basically wanting to claim dominance of Europe, right? When the French Revolution happens, that you'll learn about in your freshman and sophomore year, you'll notice that France, post-revolution, becomes really, really large, its area of influence, and partly because of Napoleon, who's a French dictator who takes control of the government and starts to create and build a giant army to sort of conquer most of the Western European landscape here. So the British and the French are at war, and we're sort of caught in the middle of this. If you remember, we go back to our Washington, Adams, Jefferson discussions. There were differences politically and economically, for that matter, over who we should support, either the British or the French. And Congress was divided over this. You know, Jeffersonians supported the French, Adams supported the British, right? But we get kind of caught up in the middle of this because we're trading, as you can see by this map, we're trading with both of these nations simultaneously, and they're both at war with each other. Now, they don't like that because we're basically trading with each other's enemy. And we tried to stay neutral for a long time, but what's going to end up happening is we just can't do that anymore. We're going to not necessarily support Napoleon, but we're going to have a much more friendlier disposition towards the French when it comes to trading than we are with the British. The British get really mad at us with the fact that we don't stop trading with the French. So what do? Well, they start to take our ships from us on the open seas. They start to seize cargo, seize the ships, and seize the sailors off the ships. There's a term that we call impressment. Impressment. I M P R E S S M E N T. Sorry for this writing, but I'm using a mouse to do this, and it's really bad, but you get the idea, okay? So this term called impressment is being used, and they're basically forcing our sailors to join British ships on the open ocean without the consent of the sailors. So they're basically saying, look, either you join the British Navy right now because you're trading with our enemy, or we're going to take your ship and we're going to leave you out here in a rowboat to try to find your way home. And of course, most sailors are not really happy with that idea. And more importantly, most trading companies who were American were really upset about this. So they go to the government and they basically say, hey, government, hey, American government, you need to do something about this. So what do? Well, we send a really, really stern letter. Don't do this anymore. You're violating our national rights as an independent nation. Do you think the British actually responded to us? Do you think that they actually did anything about that? Stopped? The answer to that is no, they didn't. They said, you guys are trading with our enemy and we can basically do whatever we want. So what happens? Well, essentially, we're going to have to end up declaring war against Britain. So if you look at some notes here, again, I've defined impressment for you. British Navy started taking soldiers off our ships to serve in the Navy. To avoid war, the US passes something called the Embargo Act. So we don't want to go to war with Britain. We don't want to go with anybody. So what do? We just say, okay, if you're not going to stop impressing our sailors, we're going to stop buying British goods from you, from the British. But this was really unsuccessful because a lot of business was still tied to Britain, and it actually really ended up hurting our economy a lot. So ultimately, we ended up having to enter a war with them. And once we did that, we hoped to do two things. Number one, to get them to stop impressing our sailors, but also we would gain some Western lands that the British were controlling in North America, primarily those lands around the Great Lakes in what we call Canada today, right? So ultimately, what happens with the War of 1812? Well, it lasts about until 1815. So it's about a 3-year long conflict. And in the end, we end up signing a peace treaty with them. There's no real exchange of territory. We really don't gain any territory from them, and we don't lose anything from them. We do gain a sense of nationalism. And this is that term from assignment 30 that I really want you to kind of focus on. This sense of pride, of being American. We also write a national anthem. The rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, that anthem, right? And another thing that comes out of the War of 1812 is an American hero. Well, at least he was an American hero in the newspapers, but he was a person by the name of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, a Southerner from Tennessee, who will go to New Orleans with a militia and vastly underwhelmed or vastly outnumbered, he will fend off a British attack of New Orleans and become an iconic American hero overnight. Later on, he will run for the presidency and he will become the 7th president of the United States. And a whole bunch of stuff will happen under Andrew Jackson's presidency that I will save in another discussion for you later on. Okay? And that's where we're going to stop today with this particular lecture. So we've covered a bit of a timeline. We've covered the Northwest Ordinances. We've talked a little bit about Jefferson's presidency and the importance of the Lewis and Clark expedition. We've talked about briefly this expanding abroad, right? This War of 1812 and sort of how it kind of comes out. In assignment number 32, I believe, you're going to have a chance to take a look more at the War of 1812 and sort of, what are some of the significant aspects about that war, okay? Again, make sure you take a look at the notes that go with this lecture. And those are the primary things that I want you to focus on or that are in those notes. And I hope everybody has a terrific, stupendous day. Thanks, everybody. Bye.